No, no, just a little.
So it is 7 p.m. We are going to go ahead and get started. I just want to welcome y'all again this week to session 2. I think this is going to be even better than last week. And last week was pretty good. And judging from what I heard from all of you, everyone really enjoyed that. I'm going to try something and we will see if it works. And that is to share the screen while still bringing people in as admin. So one of the things that we really want to do through this training is to keep you informed of resources that are out there. And so this one tonight that I want to show you in just a second, something weird happened. This website is for invisible people, invisiblepeople.tx, and I sent this out last week on the email I sent out on Tuesday. And it is a great website for all kinds of stories concerning homelessness. There's also news, different things that are going on around the country. And this is one of the things that I like about it right here, because it gives you the ability to educate yourself and others, contact your legislators, or to donate. Now, I'm going to always recommend donating to local. That's just me. But as far as contacting your legislators, I have a philosophy that you can complain about the world as it is. You can cry about the world and the sadness going on around us, or you can do something about it. And that's what tonight is about. It's about doing something. This is week 2, and tonight is particularly about housing. But our 4th week, we're going to have 4 different service providers with us, and Dustin is going to interview them about what they do in our city to work with the homeless. And that is going to be a great opportunity. Of course, the whole thing is built around equipping people to be able to serve the homeless. But if you're a person and you're like, okay, I have all this knowledge, but I don't know where to go to help people, that's what week 4 is about, to connect you with places that you can go and help our homeless neighbors. So, once again, that website was invisiblepeople.tv, and that is a great resource for you. Dustin will be offering some other resources last night. I've got a question for you, and that is, you don't have to answer it, but how many of you got an email that I sent to you? It should have been on Tuesday, and then I sent another email on Friday. The Tuesday one included resources. It also included the link to the YouTube video, which was the recorded session from last Monday night. And then Fridays was just a reminder, and it had the link and all that sort of thing. If you did not get an email, it was not because I was trying to offend you. It was really because I didn't have any way to know your email. And so tonight I'm going to ask you to do 2 things. One is, if you've got questions about, as Dustin is making his presentation tonight, I want you to go to the bottom of your screen to the chat area and just type your question in there as we go. All the questions will be held at the end like last time, but that way when we get to the end, then we'll be able to go through those and Dustin will be able to answer them for you. The second piece is, if you did not get an email from me, but you would like to get an email, then please just put your email address in the chat box and I'll make sure to include you on the email. Those emails will be going as we are doing the next several sessions, but they're not something that I'm going to be sending you on, from here on. So once this is over, the series is over, I'll be done with it. Other couple of quick things. Remember, we asked last week, if you don't mind, please stay with the live screen. that just helps us to know who you are. Quite honestly, there's a lot of folks that we've never met before, and we'd love to see your face so we can put a name and a face together, and that would be helpful. And the second one is just a reminder that this is being recorded, and so we will be able to then use anything that you do against you. And no, not really. But recording it allows us to share it with you later on, of course. So it just kind of happens that way. And most of the time, it's going to be the PowerPoint's going to be up on the screen, so you're not being recorded, every minute of this next hour. And now I think that's all of those kind of announcements. Dustin, am I correct? That's everything on my list. Okay, I got a good thumbs up from him. So I want to introduce once again, especially if you weren't here last week, to Dustin Perkins. He is a good friend of mine, and I am greatly blessed to know him and his family, and they're a sweet, great family. He's got 3 great boys. He is also the Senior Director of Client Solutions and Strategy at Austin Street Center for the Homeless in Dallas. He's also the Chairman of the Dallas Homeless Continuum of Care Assembly and the Vice Chairman of the Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance Board of Directors. Now, I'm going to let you in on something that we kept from you last week, and that is that Dustin, he's smiling now, but last week he was not quite as jovial. He tested as having COVID just a little over a week ago. And so he had COVID-19. I think it's been passed to his whole family. He's been home since that time from work and from a shelter. And so, yeah, it was kind of, I want to say amusing, but it was interesting at the end. He held up really good through all the teaching, but once you guys all left, it was like a balloon deflated because he was pretty worn out. So y'all just keep him in mind, keep him in your prayers, him and his family, and I think he's feeling pretty good tonight. But Dustin, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, it's been crazy. I started having symptoms on Monday, September 28th. So I've been home for 2 weeks, preparing all this and trying to work remotely as much as I can. Just from someone who now has had COVID-19, I don't recommend it. Just so you know, it is not a fun experience, but I'm glad it didn't make us too very sick and enabled me to still be able to be here with you guys. So I'm just really glad to be here. We're feeling great. We're doing a whole lot better, and we're just planning on getting tested again this week so that we can get our negative tests and get back out amongst society and actually interact with our family and friends. So we're excited for that. So very pleased to have each and every one of you guys here tonight. Again, I love being around people who care about people who experience homelessness, and especially people who care about solutions for people who are experiencing homelessness. There is so much more to working with people who are dealing with these issues of homelessness than handing out food and doing all the wonderful things that we do every day. And so I'm just excited to be a part of encouraging us to be working on solutions for that. And so tonight we'll get a little more practical than last week. I'm talking about what is the one solution, the one way that you can actually solve a person's homelessness, and to make sure we stay focused on that. So here is my presentation. Hopefully we can see this. And here we go. Steve, does it look good?
Yes, sir.
I made the same mistake as I did last week. I got to make sure to share my computer sound. There we go. All right. So, all right, guys. So last week we talked about the beginnings of this kind of a 101 version of, we said, what is homelessness was last week. This week, homelessness is a housing problem. Next week, we'll get even more practical. And then finally, the last week, we're going to talk about what can you do? Where can you go? How can you actually give back in order to be able to really affect real solutions for people who are experiencing homelessness in our area? This week, we're going to be hitting these questions. Last week we talked about why do people experience homelessness? What is homelessness like in our area? And what are some common misconceptions around people experiencing homelessness? This week, we're going to answer these questions. Why have we struggled to end homelessness in the last 40 years that we've seen it be a pervasive problem in our country? What should we focus on in order to make a difference in ending homelessness? And how can you engage someone about ending their homelessness? So we'll start off here about why have we struggled to end homelessness. So like last week, we talked about that there is an equation that shows us why people become homeless. And this is a very helpful equation to understand why people become homeless. But it has also contributed to why it's been difficult to resolve homelessness as well. Keep in mind that homelessness as we know it, this pervasive, persistent issue where people are consistently living on our streets or living in shelters and unsheltered locations as well, since the early 80s has been with us consistently. There are areas that have it way worse than Dallas-Fort Worth. In Los Angeles, there's over 60,000 people on a given night that are homeless. And it's crazy what you see out in that space. So the question is, why have we not been able to figure this out? We are the richest nation on the earth. Why haven't we been able to solve this problem yet? I have a theory, and I want to share that with you guys tonight, and it makes it makes a difference as to what we talk about and actually getting real solutions for people. So here's, again, to remind you guys of the homeless equation. If you guys can remember from last week, how does somebody begin to experience homelessness? And it all coalesces around this equation. 1, poverty plus crisis minus social support equals homelessness. If you ask people questions like as to why they became homeless, this generally kind of is where it coalesces around this equation. So the thing though is that this is very true. This is how people end up becoming homeless. And I want to focus on that middle part, crisis, because the crises experienced by the people that we serve are voluminous. There are tons of different crises people experience, often all at the same time. They can experience financial crisis, not having enough money coming in or not having any money coming in to where they can take care of their basic needs. They can have a mental health crisis where someone is not able to cope with their stress and they are dealing with incredible depression, or mania where they're just way too high energy and they're all over the place, or anxiety, or somebody even in the worst days is experiencing delusions and hallucinations, is seeing things that aren't there, hearing things that aren't there. And believing things that are not really true and are guiding their entire life. They're basing their life upon something that is just not true at all. So there's a lot of issues with mental health. There is also issues with physical health. This one breaks my heart just to see someone who I know is experiencing homelessness and is ambling about the streets in a walker or in a wheelchair. I cannot imagine the struggle of someone having to make it from place to place who's handicapped or physically disabled, but there are several who are. Relational issues, not just broken relationships in their family and their friends, but just having a hard time relating to strangers or talking with people where the situation gets a little difficult or tense, not being able to handle interpersonal tension. Relational issues, substance use issues. So people who start off utilizing alcohol or drugs, and maybe prescription drugs or illegal drugs, in a way that helps them to relieve their pain, and it become from an occasional user to a frequent user to a problematic user to someone who is now addicted and is spending most of their time, energy, and resources trying to fulfill those addictions. Or, something as simple as job skills. Maybe someone's job was taken away, or maybe they became disabled and not able to do a job they used to be able to do. And so now they can't seem to find work because they just don't have the skills in order to be able to enter the marketplace. There are a lot of different crises that people experience when they experience homelessness. And one of the keys to remember is that people can experience all of these crises or some of them and not actually become homeless. Like it's just because you experience one of these types of crises does not mean you are sentenced to homelessness. In fact, if you look at some of these crises, and as I was going down some of these, some of you guys can probably relate. You're like, I've been through that crisis before. I've dealt with that. Shoot, I'm dealing with that right now. You're dealing with this, and this, but you're not homeless, right? because you found a way to be able to deal with those crises. Our goal when we're working with people is to try to help them deal with those crises. That's very, very true. But the reality is that there's only one type of crisis that can actually cause someone to become homeless each and every time. And that's a crisis of housing. That's a loss of a home. If someone is able to handle all of these other crises, but is not able to handle their housing crisis, they're going to end up homeless. And it's important to stay focused on that one crisis. One of the things I'm going to say here is don't get caught in the cycle of focusing on these at the cost of delaying an end to someone's homelessness. Our focus is ending homelessness. That's what we're talking about here in this series. Not necessarily ending someone's poverty. And that is a tough pill to swallow. Homeless services, I think, have been flawed for years because we simply got distracted. Why I think it's taken us 40 years and we've not really been able to fully resolve homelessness is that we got distracted with all of these other crises in dealing with the crisis of the moment rather than putting people into a place, a home, where they can most effectively deal with their own crises. And the important thing, and what I'm going to be fighting for us tonight and talking about tonight, is that when we're serving people who experience homelessness, we want to be clear with them that the purpose of our services is to move people along a pathway to ending their homelessness, not simply to serve them inside their homelessness. Now, of course, we have to help people in the middle of their crisis. If someone has a financial crisis to the point that they're not able to eat, and we don't provide this person food, and they have no other way to get food, then they're going to die for not being able to eat. So it is important that we deal with immediate crises, but we also have to remember that the ultimate goal is not just to deal with those crises, but it's to help people get into a home. The reason we struggle to resolve homelessness on large scales is because we got distracted by treatment and by housing readiness approaches. A lot of the approaches to ending homelessness over the last 40 years are what we now call treatment first approaches, because the idea is we want to treat these crises before we'll assist someone to get into a home. And so the idea is we didn't want to set people up for failure. Our thought was, well, poverty plus crisis minus social supports equals homelessness. So you've experienced these crises, a financial crisis, a mental health crisis, substance use, whatever it is. And so we don't want to set you up for failure by putting you into a home and then you're not able to sustain it. We want to make sure that you don't end up back homeless again. So what we're going to try to do is make sure you resolve all of your crises that caused you to become homeless in the first place, and then we'll get you into a home. And so the idea was there's an evolution to how services have been done over the last 40 years. A lot of services, especially toward the beginning of the influx of homelessness in the early 80s, were spiritual services. Were focused mostly on helping people to be saved, helping people to resolve their spiritual brokenness in their relationship with God, and trying to make them more whole from the inside out yet again, and hoping that would help people resolve their homelessness because they're broken and they're sinners and they've got to find a way to wholeness so that they can be back in a home again. But unfortunately, that didn't necessarily resolve the homeless crisis. And so we tried working on getting people treatment. We said, okay, people are mentally ill. They need treatment. They need a place. They need medication. They need doctors. They need other people to counseling. They need case management to help them resolve their mental health issues. But we found that didn't necessarily end people's homelessness either. They worked on getting people sober was the next one. We focused a lot on substance use and dealing with that. And to be sure, substance use is a huge problem amongst the homeless population. But just resolving people's substance abuse issues didn't end their homelessness. And so then we said, okay, well, people need skills in order to be able to be housed again. So we provided housing. We provided transitional housing, which means that it was a home that was going to be somebody's temporarily. It usually belonged to an agency or to another person. It didn't belong to the person who was being served. And then they gave them life skills and they helped them in that home to develop the skills they needed in order to keep the home. But unfortunately, that didn't work either. It was very expensive, and a lot of people at the end of their transitional housing experience just went right back to homelessness. So this is still a popular form of homeless service, by the way, putting people through structured programming and trying to make sure that they resolve the crises that you see in front of you before we work with them to get into a home. Again, try not to help people set up for failure. But the issue is that resolving these crises usually actually doesn't resolve the person's homelessness. There's only one thing that resolves someone's homelessness. And what we found, and I found this in working with people who have been through a lot of very structured programs, that they finish a 10-month program, an 18-month program, a 24-month program. And so they've been homeless this whole time. And we've been working with them on their finances, on their mental health, on their substance use, and all the things that they need to work on. And they are a much healthier and more whole person, but they're still homeless. And they still don't necessarily have the skills it takes in order to sustain a home. The thing that we have to remember is that there is only one thing that ends homelessness: a home. And that's it. And the skills that you need to maintain a home, you can utilize and you can discover so much better in a home than outside of a home. And this mindset is incredibly important. It is so easy for clients and for people who serve them to become distracted by the crisis of the day, by the crisis du jour, because there are so many of them. And people who experience homelessness bring a lot of crises several times into their homelessness, and then they generate more as they're homeless longer and longer and longer. Like we said last week, when people are homeless, the longer they're homeless, the worse off they get, and the longer they're homeless, the harder it is to get out of it. So housing is the name of the game. If you are passionate about real solutions, and you're passionate about ending someone's homelessness, you've got to be passionate, not just about serving people experiencing homelessness, but be passionate about housing. So let's talk about what housing is, basically. What is the solution to ending homelessness? So housing is a place to live that is three things. One, it is safe. So when housing is safe, what we mean is that it has four walls, a roof, and a door that locks. That's generally what we're talking about when we say someplace is safe. That doesn't necessarily mean that the person is going to be living alone. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're living in a great area of town. Okay, so people are comfortable in different areas, but we want to make sure that someone has a basic, reasonable expectation of safety wherever they live. That's why we're not going to be sending someone who's experiencing domestic violence. We're not going to send them back to their abuser, even though they could go live with their husband or their, whoever is abusing them. They could go live there and they could end their homelessness. However, we're not going to do that because it's not safe. Okay. The second one is being decent. If you take a look at this picture of this house, it is not livable because it's all fallen down everywhere. We do not want to do that. That's not what being decent is. Decent means that it meets basic inspection standards. So it's not necessarily a place that looks nice. It's not necessarily a place, like I said, in a nice part of town. And it's not necessarily a place, this is hard, this is not necessarily a place that you would want to live, or that you would necessarily place your mom or your sister or your grandmother or whoever. This is a place that is decent. It is reasonably passable, and it is not going to fall down around our clients' ears. They're going to be safe when they live there, not only safe from harm to their person and their property, but they're also going to be safe from the place falling down around their ears. Last of all needs to be affordable. And this is tough too, because it depends on the situation as to what this really means. What I mean when I say affordable is I mean a place that can be sustainably paid for with minimum necessary ongoing assistance. Okay, so there are specific numbers where the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development considers housing to be affordable, and they call it affordable housing, whenever the person who's living there is paying less than 30% of their monthly gross income toward rent and utilities. They also say, same department, says that it is a severe housing burden if someone is paying more than 50% toward their rent and utilities. And I would definitely agree that paying less than half of your income toward rent and utilities is certainly the best place to be. Paying less than 30% is really great. But I can tell you right now, if you surveyed my team and a lot of the people who worked at my agency and they get good living wages, how many of them pay less than 30% toward their their income toward rent and utilities? Very few raise their hands. The reality is that housing costs go up and wages don't keep up. And so a lot of people are paying more than 30% toward rent and utilities. They're having to get creative with how they live. And the reality is people who are living in poverty are paying a lot more than that 50% as well. And so really, and when you talk about trying to end homelessness, and again, we're talking about ending homelessness, not necessarily ending someone's poverty. If someone who we are working with, they are experiencing homelessness, they may, be in a situation where they are still living in economic poverty, but we want them to end that homelessness because that can help them resolve all the rest of those crises that we saw. The reality is affordability is what you can sustainably live with. I have seen people who are able to pay 80% of their income toward rent and utilities, and they've learned how to manage the stress of that and figure out how to make that work sustainably. Whereas I've also seen other people who are paying $0 toward their rent, or who are paying less than 30% of their income toward their rent, and they can't seem to make it happen. And so it really depends upon each person as to what that looks like. And so that's why it's important that we walk along the journey with people we serve individually. But the thing is if we're looking at saying, okay, this is the answer to homelessness, this is what we're looking for, is just to get people into safe, decent, affordable housing. The good news is that people with extreme and severe issues are able to obtain and maintain housing with the right level of support. We're going to see a story of just such a person and a man named Lanny. So take a look at this.
He's gone. He's gone. He's gone. He's out hiding.
You know, when I was talking to this morning, I was trying to get, where did you go?
Whoa, 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 whoa. That's him.
Where?
Right here, right up there.
Right up there to your right.
Yeah.
You want to stop?
Yeah, but pull up. Let me just go.
Because you're the one I actually trust.
You're going to make me cry, Lanny.
Because you're making me cry. Because I love you.
I love you too, Lanny.
And I don't want anything bad to happen. Tell me what you're going to help me with. Anything else?
Well, we're close. We're closest we've been in 3 years to get you into housing. We're the closest we've been.
I was a street outreach worker, and our mission in that previous program was to identify people that were particularly vulnerable because of their mental illness or addiction, and if we felt they might be a danger to people, we would take them to Bellevue Hospital. 2 or 3 weeks after the hospitalization, that same person would be back on the street. The repetition of that cycle began to be very disturbing and began to raise a number of questions of, like, what are we doing? Maybe you have a little short-term gain, but that person just spent 30 days in the hospital at $1,500 a day. That's $45,000. We could have bought them a condo, certainly paid the rent for a long time. What we decided to do was to start listening to the people on the street and take our cue about what to do from them. It led very, very quickly to the idea that housing is the most important thing to a homeless person, regardless of mental illness or addiction or anything else. And once they're housed, they'll consider it. Maybe treatment, maybe reconnecting with family, maybe having their kids come back, maybe looking for a job. But the first response was always housing.
Here we are in Lanny's new apartment, and he actually went and put all his cupboards and stuff away. That's pretty amazing, man. And how long has it been since you've had an apartment?
Oh, seems like a century.
A century?
Yeah.
Well, almost has, because you were homeless since 2002.
Right.
That's insane.
Yeah, it is.
So, how you feeling?
Elated. Very good.
Yeah? It hasn't hit me yet.
I feel human again.
You feel human again. How did getting a set of keys make you feel different?
That I was finally home. That I was finally in a place where I can start focusing on bettering myself.
The remarkable thing was that people did so well. People once housed began to have a life, even though they still suffered with addiction and mental illness. People have a functional ability that is quite separate from their diagnosis, it turns out. You can believe that the government is after you, or that there are people flying in from outer space and they're going to, take over the planet. And leaving all that aside, you can still go, get a ham and cheese sandwich and some French fries and have a meal, or go shopping and all of that. They are like two hands doing independent things. So that was a great surprise, and I think most gratifying was the fact that people can get housed immediately from the street. and they can be supported to keep that housing.
So it's amazing what you can do with someone whenever you get them into a home. And it's amazing when you really focus in on the things that actually make a difference in someone staying housed. That's what you're able to accomplish to somebody. If you notice Lanny, now I don't know, I've only seen this video. I don't know Lanny personally. I don't know Mark or Sam or any of the other guys that were in the video. But when I saw Lanny on the street, you probably thought the same thing I thought. And I'm like, Lanny's drunk. Lanny probably already had, it looked like it was late morning to me, and Lanny had already had a bit too much that day. I mean, he was almost practically stereotypically drunk. I mean, even to the like, I love you, man, you know, type thing when he was with the guy, Mark, there on the street. And the thing is, if you look at it, I mean, there is so much difficulty to people's lives when they're experiencing homelessness, an incredible level of stress. And so a lot of people turn to drinking and to drugs, and their mental illness can activate too when they're on the streets. When you're on the streets, it is so daily difficult to get the basic needs that you need. It's a daily struggle to get basic needs met. Where am I going to eat? Where am I going to sleep? What am I going to be able to do to make things move forward in my life? You just can't focus on actually bettering your life. I love the way that what Lanny said when he was in a home. He said, now I can actually focus on making my life better. Another thing is that there's interruptions when you're homeless, right? There's incarceration as well as harassment. You have a hard time. Sometimes people will come and claim your spot where you had been staying, and they'll come and take it. Or you have to deal with the lack of safety out there. People get beat up a lot when they're homeless. Or also just dealing with being incarcerated is that, you know, there's a lot of things that we in our business call, you know, homeless offenses. So if we see someone's criminal background and we see trespassing, we see public urination, we see public intoxication, a lot of those have to do with the fact that somebody is homeless, and generally they wouldn't have had those experiences. And because if they were going to get drunk, then they would get drunk inside their home. They would do so safely and not doing something that would be a nuisance to others or get them in trouble with law enforcement. So point being is that a home really makes a huge difference with everything. Now imagine, what if they told Lanny that he needed to get treatment, he needed to quit drinking, he needed to deal with his mental illness, he needed to resolve all the other, I'm sure, tons of crises that Lanny had developed over the, 11 years that he had been homeless. And they said, you need to deal with all of those things and fix all of those problems, and then we'll work with you to find a home. Probably never would have happened. I don't know that Lanny would have had the capacity in order to be able to jump through all of those hoops to get the thing that he most basically needed to end his homelessness, and that's a home. And so treatment first programs like that, like what I just described to you, even have rules that someone can lose their housing if they re-engage in that crisis behavior. In the program that Lanny is in, if he somehow starts drinking again or gets drunk or things like that, his case manager or his support worker is going to talk with him about that, but he's going to talk with him about it in the mode of keeping his housing and saying, not about like, hey, you need to stop drinking just because, it's morally wrong. They can say, no, hey man, like, let's make sure we're trying to manage what you're dealing with so that you don't end up, blowing up at your landlord and you end up getting evicted. And so the focus is really, really different. I hope you're seeing that. Instead of focusing on the myriad of crises that a person can encounter, when you focus on housing first, instead of everything else, you are really only having to focus on 3 things. And so this helps to keep us really focused in the work that we're doing. There's only 3 parts to keeping a home, and 3 things that someone has to do to keep a home. And that's anybody. So that means me, you, someone who's homeless for 5 minutes, or someone who's homeless for 20 years, that all of us have to do the same things in order to keep a home. Number 1 is to find accessible housing. And so what I mean by that is, it's housing that is available, that is ready, and that somebody is willing to provide. One of the things that we deal with is a housing shortage a lot of times. Less than 1% of units are empty in North Texas. I'm sorry, pardon me, I need to go through a couple of other things before I go to my next slide so you can see what I'm talking about here. We also talking about paying rent and being a good neighbor are going to be the other two things that we need to talk about. We'll go into detail on those in just a second here. But a part of accessible housing, and the source I got this from is a place called zipatlas.com, which goes through a lot of information about our zip codes. But it shows that Dallas right now has 33,716 vacant units right now, with 6.79% of rental units being vacant. Looked up Irving as well, 4,073 vacant units in Irving, with 5.17% of rental units being vacant. So imagine that compared to a homeless population in Dallas of approximately 10,000 people per year, in Irving of approximately 400 people who experience homelessness per year. And so if you just look at those numbers together, and just like, we could end homelessness 3 or 4 times over if we just filled up those units. And you see that in a lot of municipalities where the number of vacant units far exceeds the number of people who are experiencing homelessness. But the reality is it's a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot of factors in filling units. First of all, there's an acceptable vacancy rate inside of apartment complexes, multifamily units, of 5%. That creates a landlord-friendly market, because the idea is that if someone has a vacancy rate of 5%, if 5% of their units are open, that is considered an acceptable loss. And so they're not going to be motivated to fill those units. The reality is rental units oftentimes have several different units that they have a hard time filling for various reasons. Either they're not made ready, or they're renovating a building, or there's a unit that's like really close to the dumpster and so it smells kind of funny. I mean, there's a lot of different things that could cause a unit not to be rentable or usable on a constant basis. Sometimes units are substandard and are just simply not ready. It takes an apartment complex or a rental property a long time to get the unit ready. Sometimes we deal with the fact that the type of unit we need is not available in a particular area. One thing we dealt with for a long time is in working in Dallas, is that in South Dallas, it's really hard to find a 1-bedroom apartment available, but really easy to find 2- and 3-bedroom apartments. In North Dallas, it's the exact opposite problem. Really easy to find 1-bedrooms, but hard to find 2s and 3s. So sometimes finding the unit that you need is not available in the area that you want at the right time. And so finding accessible housing. The other thing is too, sometimes the housing won't accept the type of payment that you have. So even if you have a client who has a Dallas Housing Authority voucher or is on some kind of homelessness program or something like that, right now there is not a law that says that an apartment complex has to accept a voucher of any kind. So the apartment complex may say, yeah, this person looks okay, but I'm not accepting that type of payment. And so you have to be dealing with accessible housing. Not only that, but you got to help someone learn how to pay their rent. Can you guys still see my screen? It's not moving forward. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to try to do it again. Sorry, guys. Okay. Share my screen again. Okay. We're going to move on. We've already seen this. No, come on. All right, there we go. Sorry about that. All right, we're going to move right along. Talking about paying rent and being a good neighbor. Who got locked up again at the same exact spot? Okay. We may have to do it in a different way. Let's see if I can do it this way. Okay, that worked. So we're going to try this again. All right, paying rent and being a good neighbor. There we go. back to it. That was your intermission there. Okay, so paying rent and being a good neighbor. So rent issues that we can run into when we're focusing on trying to help someone be housed again, we have to find accessible housing. We also have to help them pay rent and be a good neighbor. Rent issues can be simply maximizing income. Sometimes someone has no income, or doesn't have enough income to meet their basic needs, much less pay rent. So sometimes they're going to need a little bit of help. They may have enough income, but they need some money management skills. They need to learn how to focus on paying rent as the number 1 priority. Sometimes it's an issue of, substance use or mental illness. Other times it's just an issue of not prioritizing the right things. I've had clients who paid, like they couldn't pay a deposit on their apartment because they spent too much money on their kid's birthday, something like that. So just trying to help people prioritize the right things. Also trying to help people learn to deal with rents being raised at the lease renewal is one of the issues that we find. Like I said before, that wages aren't keeping up with rents. Oftentimes at lease renewal, the rent will go up incredibly quickly or a lot at that time. Rent sometimes is raised illegally. We have to teach people their rights as people being housed as well, because sometimes landlords will try to raise the rent in the middle of the lease, which is not legal, but they'll try to do it anyway. And so we have to try to help people learn how to deal with that. Also, being a good neighbor, that can incorporate a lot of different things. Learning how to follow their lease, learning how to keep their unit clean and accessible. Sometimes it's just about being kind to your neighbors and being kind to your landlord, being patient. So what are you going to do when your landlord tells you, your AC just went out and your landlord is telling you it's going to take a month to get it fixed? How do you keep your cool in the middle of that situation so you don't get evicted? Another thing is also trying to help people understand what their rights are and learn how to deal with if their rights are being violated due to fair housing. Keep in mind that the Fair Housing Act protects people. They cannot be denied housing, nor can they be removed from housing if they're a part of if they are for reasons of being a part of a protected class. And so those classes are skin color, disability, family status, national origin, race, religion, gender, sexual orientation. And so treating people their rights so that they can be able to stay in housing when they face discrimination. So all we got to really focus on is those 3 things. And we're trying to help people keep a home, except finding accessible housing, paying rent, being a good neighbor. Instead of just focusing on all those other different crises that this person is going to experience right in front of you, and they're going to continue to experience or create new crises along the way, instead of getting distracted with that, we're focusing on housing first. Now, I want to talk about a little bit about that very philosophy of service called housing first. Now, I did have a video for us, but unfortunately, we do not have time to show that. We're going to put this in the notes that's going to get sent out in the email tomorrow. But there is a great YouTube channel by a gal named Gwen Hayworth, Haworth, and she teaches the principles of housing first. I'm going to go over these really briefly here, but there's about an hour's worth of videos that goes through them in a lot more detail in a very engaging way. So I definitely encourage you to come and see that. So housing first is a philosophy that was developed in the early 1990s by Sam Simbaris, who was the PhD gentleman that you saw on the video today. He developed that in a program called Pathways to Housing in New York City. The idea was just what he said, is that instead of trying to help people deal with all their myriad treatment issues first, we gave them housing first and then helped them learn how to live inside that housing. Here are the principles of housing first. It's important that you know this, so you know this is the philosophy that has been proven most effective in ending homelessness across the world. Number 1, the first principle is housing. Immediate access to housing without any regard to housing readiness conditions. So that means that a housing first program or a housing first philosophy is going to be supporting housing focused activities and have a laser focus on housing focused activities. So that's what we are looking at. How can we get you housed again as the primary thing we need to work on first, and then we can work on the rest of your treatment issues. We work on housing before everything else, and we work on everything else because of housing. So we might focus on somebody's substance use problem. For instance, I had a gentleman that was at Austin Street who made over $3,000 a month, tax-free, by the way. That's after taxes, made $3,000 a month, yet had been homeless for 3 years straight. And his particular reason is he was homeless because he had a severe, raging crack addiction. This guy gave his debit card to the dope dealer every single month. And so he had such a bad addiction, it caused him not to give up his access to his funds to where he couldn't get housed. And we kept telling him, buddy, I can end your homelessness tomorrow with as much income as you've got. So in his case, we needed to deal with the substance use issue, but it wasn't just because we wanted him to be off of substances. It was because we wanted him to get housed again. And the thing about that is it really helps you to commiserate with the person that you're working with. Because the person that you're serving, what they want is they want to be housed again. They may not want to stop using substances. They may not want to reduce their drinking. They may not want to get mental health care or mental health treatment. They may not want to do any of those things, but I can almost guarantee you what they do want is to have 4 walls, a roof, and a door that locks. All right, we're going to move on to the second principle, which is choice. It's important to maximize our client's choice and self-determination, meaning they'll choose what kind of housing that they go into. They choose where the location of their housing is, not necessarily the exact address, but we ask them, what area of town do you want to live in? And there's a lot of different options wherever they want to go. They choose what services to receive and how often to receive those services. Sometimes that can be really difficult because we can look at someone's life and go, "Ugh, you have such a hard time making good decisions. I can make so much better decisions for you." But the reality is we need our clients to own and take responsibility for their decisions. And that can happen so much better when they have choice. When I was running housing programs for Metro Care Services for several years, we realized that whenever we had to push somebody into housing because there was only one available unit and we had to get them in right now, and when we didn't really give them a lot of choice, the first time something went wrong in that housing unit, whose fault do you think it was? Whose responsibility was it to fix it? The client wasn't thinking about, oh, I need to take care of this. They looked at me and go, you put me here. This is your fault that I'm experiencing this problem, right? And so the idea is, but when I gave them at least one other choice, when I gave them at least 2 choices as to where they could go, then when they went there almost every time, when something went wrong, they're going, I need to do something about this. I need to take care of this. It really helps to empower this person when they live with choice. Third of all is recovery. It's important to remember that in a housing first philosophy, we're not abandoning recovery. We're not abandoning looking at people becoming sober and clean and mentally healthy and physically healthy and having great well-being. There is a great focus on well-being and access to supports. At Austin Street Center, where I work, it is a housing-focused, housing-first shelter, but we do have AA on campus, NA on campus. We have 3 different types of support groups. We have mental health care, 2 different types of mental health care providers on our campus. We have physical health care providers on our campus. All those crises that we talked about, we have ways to handle and to deal with those because sometimes they're so immediate, you have to deal with them in that moment. And we want that service to be available immediately. So housing first doesn't mean housing only. It doesn't mean that we put someone into a unit and say, okay, good luck, see you later, we'll see what happens, right? This is about trying to help people have well-being. So it's getting them into a home first, but then focusing on their well-being. It's a bias toward harm reduction approaches, but a client can choose abstinence only. So there's so much to go into with this, and unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of time left. I'm losing time here. But recovery is an important aspect of housing first. Also, support, meaning those supports that are provided to the person is individualized and person-driven. Maybe includes a rent payment supplement, maybe not. And the important thing to know is that the person who's in the housing, them choosing to access the supports is totally separate from their housing supports. That someone is going to be providing you assistance to stay housed, regardless if you go to mental health care, if you are trying to reduce your drinking or your substance use, or if you're going to recovery meetings or things like that, that the housing and the supports are totally separate. Last of all is community, social and community integration. And this is where the rubber meets the road when you're working with people who are housed after experiencing homelessness. This is where life really becomes truly living, is being reintegrated into society. And that's why we prefer scattered site approaches, trying to make sure people are around other people who are not necessarily have a history of homelessness, people who are just working stiffs, going to work every single day, just like you and me. And so that's a good way to do that. So those are the 5 principles of housing first. There's a lot of evidence around that style of work as opposed to trying to get people to go to treatment first. You're going to receive a link to a PDF tomorrow. It's a 2-pager on all the evidence, a great summary of all the evidence for housing first approaches. Housing first approaches have been found to end homelessness more quickly and more often. If it's been found to save money, to be a cheaper approach to ending homelessness than anything else. It keeps people housed longer, and it's especially effective with people who are very difficult to house, who have very severe problems. So I want to land here by talking a little bit about how do you have that housing first conversation? How do you talk with, when you're engaging somebody, you're maybe doing a feeding, or you're meeting somebody on the street, or maybe it's somebody that you're taking out to, giving them some food after, when they're panhandling or something like that. How do you have a housing first conversation? I want to give you a couple of different ideas for that. So first of all, make sure that the focus is always on housing as opposed to the immediate crisis. You're always focused on what's coming up next when it comes to getting into a home. There's a lot of different great examples that I was going to give you. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of time, but I do want to say that one of my favorite things to do is when I hear someone make a lot of complaints about where they are or about the service that they're receiving. If you've been working with anybody who's experiencing homelessness, you know that sometimes they have very high standards and really want something different than what they've been provided. I know on Austin Street, I hear people complain about the food. We actually have really, really great food at Austin Street. Often our clients eat better than I do at night. But the thing is that they'll say, I don't like it, it's too salty, or, why don't you guys get something from this restaurant every once in a while, or the spaghetti sauce was, too acidic or whatever. And so in those cases, instead of giving into the complaint and talking about the complaint and the concern, I try to listen and then come back and bring it to housing. And I'll say, man, that's really rough. I'm so sorry to hear you're dealing with that. What are you doing to work on your housing right now so that you don't have to deal with this anymore? I mean, I love it that one of my case managers would say to somebody, it's very risky, but they would say this to a person and say, I know places like this will kill you, man. You gotta find something else. And so try to help continue to bring the motivation, whatever they've got energy around, whatever their concern is, instead of just delving into that concern, turn that energy toward housing. Another example is a powerful question is just constantly be asking, what's your plan? What's next for you? What's your plan to be able to work on this? And if they're like, man, I don't know, or I'm just waiting on, that's one of the things we never like to hear is, I'm waiting on this, that, or the other. No, let's find something you can be active in. What can you actually be doing? And try to help someone problem solve around that to get to that one next step that could help them get into housing. Another thing is when you're talking with somebody, and I said this a little bit last week, but be talking to people and ask questions, but don't be an interrogator. Don't be trying to be a detective or you're trying to catch them in a lie. Be a fan of this person. Think about the one person you'd love to invite to dinner, your hero, a sports figure or an actor or an actress or a politician or a world leader or whatever, somebody who you'd love to have over for dinner. If you had that person over for dinner, you would ask them so many questions, and not because you're trying to catch them in a lie or because you disagree with them or you're trying to convince them of something, but it's because you really just want to get to know them. You just want to know what's going on with them just because you're just so interested in their life. Be interested in these people. Be a fan of these people. And ask all these questions and check those answers too. Like we talked about last week, sometimes people can remain homeless for a long period of time just because of a bit of misinformation. We sometimes need to help with that. All right. Last of all, just realize that a solid housing conversation can truly change someone's life. Asking the right question at the right time can turn their mind and turn their heart towards solutions, whereas previously they had lost hope and would remain homeless. Now they can be housed partly just because of having a single conversation. So I want to end on this, to be reminded about being passionate about housing. And again, so we want to love people who are experiencing homelessness, and that was what we were talking about last week. Love on those people, but we need to be passionate about solutions as well, passionate about housing. And I'll tell you what drives me is the thought of this, that truly, guys, and I truly believe this, that housing, safe, decent, and affordable housing is a basic human right. And I hope you agree with me on that. I've had a lot of conversations around that and people push back on me about that. But I'm telling you, the United Nations in the early 90s, so for over 20 years, has declared that housing is a human right. It says the right to live somewhere in security, peace, and dignity is a basic human right. And that doesn't mean that it has to be free, okay? Because none of the rest of our rights are necessarily free, or they're not easy. They don't come cheap. Having free housing for everybody is not possible. And it's not what we were seeking for. The issue is when something is a human right, it doesn't mean that it's free. It just means that it's accessible. It just means that everybody should have it available to them. Because if you don't believe that housing is a human right, think about then who should be on the streets? Who should have to live on the streets? Should it be people who are not saved? Should it be people who are addicts? Should it be people who are mentally ill? Should it be someone who just doesn't know how to look for a home? I don't think any of us would agree that any of those people should have to live on the streets. I was really struck this week by a guy named John Masseri. He's over a nonprofit in Los Angeles, California. And he took a tour with a European professor at Skid Row, which is a huge homeless encampment. Over 4,000 people experiencing homelessness on a given night in this one single encampment in downtown Los Angeles. And he said, what do you think? How are you feeling after seeing this site? And what he said is this: I'm horrified. I'm absolutely horrified. The richest country on earth, and yet you let your citizens live like abandoned animals on the streets. In my country, this would never be tolerated. We would overthrow the government if they allowed this. We have to get passionate about housing being a right for each and every person. Advocate for this. Vote for this. Believe this, that no one should have to experience homelessness, that homelessness should be rare, brief, and a one-time occurrence. It should never happen twice in someone's life, God forbid. And housing should be readily available to everyone with support necessary in order to keep it. This is what, again, the homeless services have looked like in the history. People are sinners. They need to repent and find Jesus. People are mentally ill, need to be diagnosed and treated. People are addicted. They need to go to detox or treatment and become sober. They're broken and need life skills. They need transitional housing. And here's where we landed after 40 years of what we realized that's most effective in bringing real solutions to people is that people are people and they need housing. So the last thing I just want to say is this, is that if you are serving people experiencing homelessness and you are not participating in helping people to be housed, you are missing out. I'm telling you, it is the best stuff ever in helping people who are experiencing homelessness. And this is the real deal, and I truly believe this, that no matter what you're doing, no matter if you're serving food, if you're running a nonprofit, if you're engaging someone on the street, if you're not talking about housing, you are having the wrong conversation. So hopefully next week we're going to get even more practical about that, talking about 10 different types of housing that are available in the community and how basically people can access them, to try to give you some really good specifics on how you can help someone to actually end their homelessness. Thank you guys for being with me, and I hope you're getting a lot out of this, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Take it away, Steve. Steve, you're muted. There you go.
Sorry about that. The dogs were going crazy earlier. Sorry. Anyways, we talked about the very beginning about how it's easy to get angry. It's easy to get upset, okay? But if we're really going to make a difference, we've got to get involved and we've got to do something about it. And so that's what led me to get involved to the extent that I have. And I know that many of you, that's right where you're at. And when Dustin spoke about that, if you're not involved in getting folks housed, that you're missing part of it. And I would just say that the pastor in me, there are 2 times that it is incredible to sit with a person or to be with a person when they're experiencing something. One, and for me it's the top one, is when they become a Christian, when they ask Christ in their life. There's just nothing like it, okay? The second one, okay, is when you help a homeless person get housed. And I've had the honor of being involved with that, working with a team of people several times. And last week I spoke about the young lady Ashley and her 3 kids that got housed 2 weeks ago. Ashley started up in Illinois, and she left Illinois and came down to Texas because an ex-boyfriend who was in prison was being released And she was concerned for the safety of her family. And so she left there and came to Texas. She arrived in November, Thanksgiving week of 2019. So not even a year. She immediately went to stay at an extended stay because she was new to town. She got a job. She got her kids in school. And then March came and COVID hit. And she lost her job. And she was this close to losing the place where she stayed. And she connected to Ruby at Crisis Ministries. And Ruby was helping a lot of single families at that point. And she called us and we adopted Ashley. And we helped to make sure she had food. We helped to make sure she had a phone, because if you don't have a phone and a way to communicate these days, how are you going to look for a job? How are you going to find an apartment? How are you going to work on stuff for your kids? Okay. So we helped her to do that. We helped her with resources, with a crock pot, a toaster, stuff like that. She didn't have any of that. And then we had a family that basically got to know her and built a relationship with her and her family. And so that went on for about 6 months. We got her connected by calling the homeless hotline with the city of Irving. Okay. And she called there. She left her information. It took a while, but when she was housed 2 weeks ago, it was by working through the program, a federal grant through the city of Irving. Okay. And then this last Sunday, this was her third time at church. Of course, Christ Church has been closed the last 6 months, so it's only our second time that Christ Church has been open. But it was her third time at the church. And you would not have believed it, because this young lady who I talked to quite a bit, she was so shy. She was so, not talkative. And guys, she had 3 kids below, I think, the age of 8, okay, in a 1-room hotel room for 6 months. How would you be? And, but spending time with her this last Sunday, she was like a new person. And, that was, like I said, we were able to help her with housing. She didn't have to worry about that. She didn't have to worry about her vehicle anymore, which she had some severe issues with that. And then we could have told her, well, we can't get you housed until you get a job, because she didn't have a job during this time. Her old job that laid her off back in March, they furloughed her. And 3 months later, they came back and said, yeah, we'll bring you on at $4 less an hour than what we paid you before. And so that didn't work. And so anyways, the same week that she found out she was getting housed, she was able to, she found out she got a job with Amazon. And so she is, in a good place right now. And that relationship and that friendship, and there's nothing like it. But the thing is that each of you have the ability to be that advocate, to be that person, to stand by folks. Ashley's easy. She's a sweet young lady, okay, with awesome kids. It's not always that easy, okay? Many of you know that some of our homeless, man, they're tough to be friends with. Sometimes it's because of mental illness and they're on their meds. Sometimes it's because of addictions. Sometimes they make decisions that, man, you're like, why are you doing that, okay? Because it doesn't compute with you. But it doesn't mean that they don't need friends and advocates to point them, to ask them if they have a plan, and then help them work their plan, to point them in the right direction, to give them wisdom. It doesn't mean you're their buddy. It doesn't mean you're trying to rescue them, but to help them move forward in their life so they can get into housing and get their life going in the right direction again. There's just nothing like it. So I want to challenge you to, as we continue this series next week and the week after, to be thinking about what you can do, how you can make a difference. Not everyone is going to be that volunteer that works at Crisis Ministries or Many Helping Hands or Family Promise, but you can all play a part in helping to get our folks housed. So now, Dustin, I had a couple of questions for you. The first one from Lenora was, have you found much housing discrimination in the DFW area?
Definitely. We run into it over and over again. The issue is a lot of times people who are experiencing homelessness, especially the folks that we've worked with in Austin Street, sometimes you're going to find people with PhDs and master's degrees and who can really handle their business. But a lot of folks we've dealt with have difficulty reading. Some people can't read at all. And so they typically don't know their rights. And so a lot of the times it's important for us as advocates to be stepping in to try to help people understand their rights. The forms of discrimination I typically find is somebody will not want to house someone because they're homeless, or they won't want to house them because of their disability or something like that. So a lot of times, or I should say too, like a criminal background or something like that. So if somebody has a criminal background, but that is acceptable by the standards of the apartment complex, but the landlord just doesn't like the person, then they'll find some other reason to bring up as to why they can't house them or whatever. There's other issues in also the fees that are charged. There's a lot of inconsistency. One of the things that I hate in apartment complexes today is the risk fee. I don't know if you guys have ever heard this, but there's administration fees, there's application fees, there's risk fees, then there's deposits. And it's amazing what people will charge somebody, even someone who's in poverty, just to get into the unit. We've had families that we've assisted to be housed before who were paying 2 months rent in a risk fee. And the risk fee is completely arbitrary. It's legal. The landlord can charge it of anybody as long as they have a policy around charging it. And so sometimes I've seen families who it's going to cost $2,400 for them to get into a unit. And that's not even with deposit or starting their utilities or buying their household goods. It's just a fee they have to pay, and they'll never get it back. So there's a lot of things like that that happen that are some discriminatory practices. I've only had it one time where someone just blatantly on the phone basically told me they're going to discriminate against my client. They said, I'm going to charge him a double deposit because he's homeless. And I'm like, well, that doesn't mean that he's going to do anything. And does your policy say you charge all homeless people double deposits? I don't think so. And so he charged a single deposit to my guy. But anyway, I think the thing is that we have to overcome is there are certain ways that we teach our clients to ask questions. So one of the things, we don't tell our clients to say, what kind of criminal backgrounds do you take? We don't want to activate a landlord's paranoia. So instead, we teach the client to say, like, what are your renting requirements? And so then the landlord has to tell them what make them tell you what the policy is before you start telling them your whole story, so they can find a way to get around it. So anyway, yes, I have seen a lot of housing discrimination, and you have to teach clients, I think, a lot of times to be a little creative, especially if they have a lot of barriers.
So the next question, Dustin, is would you say that housing should be a priority for those experiencing homelessness?
There's only 2 times that it's important for someone who's experiencing homelessness to be thinking about housing and prioritizing housing. Only 2 times. That is always and all the time. There is, if you are in, and that's what and it's hard though, because someone who's experiencing homelessness, like I said, has a myriad of different crises that they're dealing with. And they're all very, very, very important. They're all very, very, very urgent in that moment. And it's crippling the stress of all the crises that you have to deal with when you're experiencing homelessness. And so a lot of times what we find that we have to do when we're helping somebody is we have to, like I said, kind of in those conversations, really redirect people. And so like one of the things that we've started to say to our clients, for instance, is we say, how can I help you resolve your housing crisis today? And so instead of talking about all the rest of the stuff that they're dealing with, I say, like, let's talk about resolving your housing crisis and remind them that, hey, your housing is actually an immediate crisis that you need to deal with. Because once you deal with that, then you'll really be able to deal with everything else. And sometimes it takes some convincing, especially if a person has been homeless for a long period of time. I talked about this last week, that homelessness starts off as an emergency and then it becomes a lifestyle. And for those whom homelessness has become a lifestyle, and again, that's not a moral failing on the person experiencing homelessness' part. That's just them adapting to a terrible situation and trying to find a way to make the most of it. So the situation is we have to help remind people, hey, you've been homeless for 11 years. you had a housing crisis for 11 years, and we need to resolve that crisis and make sure we prioritize that. Oftentimes that mindset is difficult to come by, especially if someone's been homeless for a long time. But yes, absolutely prioritize housing more than just about anything else, besides just true immediate emergency critical needs. I have another question, Steve, that came across to me in a private message, and it was the question came and said that can tiny homes that cost between $10,000 and $20,000 help in areas of low housing availability? That is a great question. Tiny homes are a really cool concept. In case you don't know what that is, basically it's the concept of creating very, very, very small units, like 300 to 400 square feet, so smaller than even an efficiency apartment. And the idea behind it is, well, they're really, really cheap to build, and you can mass produce them, and so you can really help people to have more housing availability. They have not, though, been widely accepted across the nation. And I'll be honest with you, I struggle sometimes to really understand that. Similar to the way that I struggle to understand why Irving has 4,000 available units and only 400 homeless people per year, yet we can't seem to end homelessness in our area, right? Like the math just doesn't seem to work. But in this situation, a lot of times what prevents tiny homes from succeeding is a lot of other small things. First of all, tiny homes, typically cities don't like to do tiny homes because it's a small parcel of land, and so therefore the property value is very low, and so the property taxes on them are very low. And so oftentimes, as far as the benefit for the city financially is actually pretty low in those areas. And so oftentimes you find that cities don't, I mean, any city, not just Irving or whatever, but like a lot of cities really don't like to do tiny homes. I think also because the tiny homes tend to be done as projects that concentrate people who experience homelessness, a lot of times they can have a lot of issues and they need a lot of support there in order to do it. So just because the home might cost 10 to 20,000, I'm not really sure about the cost exactly of tiny homes. I've seen tiny homes that cost upwards of $70,000 and $80,000 a pop. But just because the cost of building it is relatively low doesn't mean the cost of maintaining it stays low, doesn't mean the cost of the support that's going to take to be in that area is low either. And so I will say, though, too, the spirit behind that question is great, because part of the reason why we're seeing so much homelessness now is that we've gotten rid of a lot of small living spaces. We used to have a lot of things they call SROs, single room occupancy units. We only have one of those left in Dallas, whereas that used to be very prolific. And that was a way for people who had very little income to be able to sustain housing. And so they have very little, it was a way people could sustain housing, but we've torn a lot of them down. And so housing standards and actually having higher standards for our housing has kind of actually contributed to homelessness in some ways, shapes, and forms. So I know that's a lot to swallow, but I don't know if it's a great answer to your question. Tiny homes is a really intriguing model that has just not really gotten a lot of traction anywhere yet. And there's been some little models. There's one model of it in Dallas called the Cottages at Hickory Crossing. That's actually just down the street from Austin Street Center. That's run by City Square. Another one is the Community First Village that's near Austin that gets a lot of press as well. But those are both very supportive housing projects with on-site security and on-site case management and all these different support services. A lot of people have had a really hard time taking a risk on tiny homes without that level of support attached to it.
So if you could, Dustin. So I'll just be honest with you guys that when Dustin and I get going on these conversations, they can last hours, but we won't keep you there here for hours to discuss this. There's a lot more to be discussed on this. I'm dying to share, but I won't, because we want to respect your time. And so thank y'all for being here. We'll be here next Monday. What's the topic again, Dustin?
The topic is 10 ways to end homelessness, getting real practical about what kind of housing people can access.
Okay. So thank y'all for being here, and you'll be getting a follow-up email tomorrow. Feel free to share that with whoever. And yeah, if you want to get in contact with Dustin, holler at me and I will get you in contact with him. And thank y'all for being here tonight. You've been a lovely audience.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. That was good.
Stay well, stay safe, and end homelessness. Appreciate it.